Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. We're going to be discussing Russia's increasing use of Iranian military equipment. Iran has been providing ballistic missiles that are threatening and ending the lives of ordinary and day-to-day Ukrainians. I'm Reagan King. I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. Simon, what we've seen in recent days is Iran supplying ballistic missiles to Russia. It tells us everything we need to know about Russia and where they stand ethically in this conflict. And it certainly tells us that Iran is not only a threat in the Middle East, they are a growing threat in relation to Europe as well.
Absolutely, because what we've seen really is an escalation since the middle of October of this year, where the Iranians have been supplying Putin's military force with military drones that are using to attack civilian population centers, particularly in the capital of the Ukraine, Kiev, but also at energy plants, at water power stations, and other essentials for the Ukrainians. So this is a very troubling trend. We've seen Iran's malign and disturbing influences in the Middle East, with its propping up of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, for example, and having 90,000 troops and militias under its control in Syria, its sponsorship and support for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, supplying them with anything between 160 and 180,000 rockets and missiles. They're sponsoring Hamas in Gaza and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're sponsoring the Houthis in Yemen and are certainly extremely belligerent. But this is really the first time now that the Iranians have shifted their attention from the Middle East to Europe, and this provides a massive security concern for Europe. And this is why there are calls now that NATO, our defence alliance, who is engaging covertly or not so covertly in helping the Ukrainians repel the Russian invasion.
Yeah, this is a reminder to Western nations, that authoritarian regimes, as Russia is, as Iran is, who hold deeply anti-Semitic ideology, as both Russia and Iran do, and have done historically, pose a threat to Israel, also pose a threat to the West. So the question for thought this evening is, should NATO now declare Iran as an enemy and a security threat to the West? Despite the leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran's constant lies that it has not been providing Moscow with deadly military drones that have killed ordinary Ukrainians, we see it's finally admitted to doing just that. They've been vociferously denying involvement. Now there is no option. Of course, this would always be discovered at some point, because the military drones will be shot down. Ballistic missiles can be traced and tracked and have a primary point of origin that can be discovered through various investigations. And so they've had no other choice than to admit their involvement in this conflict. What this demonstrates is that Iran is actively involved with Russia. Russia is actively involved with Iran. We've known that a little bit, Simon, because of this ongoing Iran deal that we see the Biden administration is seeking and it's been involved in. Russia is involved in those negotiations and in that contact.
Actually leading those negotiations. And this is what's made things very awkward in terms of the Iran deal, because clearly the Iranian regime has decided to take sides in this conflict, just as the West has. And so what we're really seeing is not only a stronger political ties between Russia under Putin and also Iran, but also strengthening of military and security and intelligence ties, which is extremely troubling, particularly when we know the nature of this rogue regime in Iran that has constantly, ever since it came to power in 1979 through the Islamic Revolution 43 years ago, its main intention has been to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And it wants to establish what is known as an Islamic Shiite crescent that will dominate the Middle East. And of course, they're halfway there to achieving that. They're in control of Iraq, they're in control of Syria, they're in control of Lebanon, and the ultimate ambition is to take Jerusalem for the Islamic Republic of Iran. And of course, now what they're doing is they're having very close ties now with Russia. Russia needs Iranian help. So this is what we're effectively seeing now, is that the Iranians have entered European soil and are actually training the Russians in how to use these military drones.
Well, of course, Iran desires to establish a worldwide caliphate, and it's short-sighted to think that their sights are only set on the Middle East. That can be our Western mindset. We think, okay, that's them over there, as long as they keep themselves to themselves. But that's not the teaching of Islam. That's not the ideology of jihad on either Sunni or Shia ground. So the goal is to establish a worldwide caliphate, and anyone who thinks that Iran is not involved or messing about with our security needs to have a reality check as well, because we've seen Kim McCallum, who's the head of our British intelligence, indicating that the Iranian regime this year alone has attempted to murder and kidnap at least 10 critics of the Iranian government on British soil. It's quite common to see scenes from Iran's government where various individuals who will, as any government does, have disagreements on a range of things, they unite together in their chanting "Death to America." And so we see this as a repeated action wherein there's animosity toward the West. This isn't just about money. Some people think, well, surely, that they want some of the Russian money, some of that oil money getting their way. Iran doesn't need Russia's money. Iran has its own resources. Iran has its own infrastructure. But having an ally in Russia and a sort of a mutual pact in some way, we could be seeing, I don't know, maybe another axis of evil formed here.
I think we are, Reagan, but also I think it's also important to mention now that Russia is now the strongest player in the Middle East, because over the last couple of decades, particularly under US President Obama, we've seen an American withdrawal from the Middle East, a military withdrawal, which has left a political vacuum which has been filled by Russia, because we know that Russian forces propped up Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. There was, I think, somewhere in the region of maybe 120,000, if not more, Russian troops based in Syria. I don't know the exact number, but it's a very, very high number. And of course, without that Russian intervention in Syria, Bashar al-Assad's regime would have collapsed to the rebel Sunni forces. There's no doubting that whatsoever. So of course, what we're seeing really is that Russia has become the kind of biggest player in the Middle East, and that's why the Iranians then, with that Russian protection, see that alliance as being extremely important. And of course, we put this into context, how Israeli-Russian relations over the last few months have deteriorated, to the extent that the Russians have closed the work of the Jewish Agency in Russia. They are preventing Russian Jews from making aliyah to Israel. They have threatened Israel that they will turn a blind eye to Israel's military operations in Lebanon and in Syria, whereby the Israelis have been trying to stop Hezbollah getting their hands on laser-guided missiles that would essentially be a game changer in the Middle East and pose a massive threat. And before, Russia has turned a blind eye to these things, but now they're threatening the Israelis. If you supply the Ukrainians with the missile dome system, then essentially what we'll do then is that we will then become an enemy. So if you want to carry out airstrikes against Iranian military interests in Syria, in Lebanon, you have to come against us first, which then makes war between Israel and Russia a little bit more inevitable. So we have to put that into context, geostrategically, as well as what's happening on European soil. I mean, it's absolutely unimaginable that a Middle Eastern state is playing a major role and undermining European security in Europe. And this issue alone should get our Western leaders and leaders of Nato to be extremely concerned and start to identify Iran as an enemy.
Iran has not shown itself and its government to be a trustworthy source of information, and so only last month its representative to the United Nations was strongly denying claims that it was involved in and responsible in supplying Iranian-built made drones wreaking havoc on the Ukrainian people. The exact quote by Iran's ambassador to the UN, his name's Amir Iravani, was made in mid-October, so again, recent history. Iran has consistently advocated for peace and the immediate end to the conflict in Ukraine, adding that the claims that Iranian weapons were being used were, quote, unfounded and unsubstantiated, end quote, and were just part of a disinformation campaign the West was mounting against his country. But just back on the 17th of October, a little over a month ago, the residents of Kiev woke up to loud explosions as Russia had once more launched military drone attacks on Ukrainian civilians. But these ones were different. These drones were different in that they were Iranian-made Shahed 136 suicide drones. And so Iran's government has been well and truly found out here. The lies very swiftly unraveled and has been forced to acknowledge its involvement. It's believed that these Iranian-supplied drones have killed 10 Ukrainian citizens to date and have definitely brought fear and compounded that in Ukraine's streets.
Absolutely. And then also, according to the think tank based in Washington, D.C., known as the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, have said that Iran has been deploying military advisors to Ukrainian occupied territories to help Russian forces operate these drones. And Ukrainian military officials recently have claimed to have killed 10 Iranian military advisors in the Crimean. And also then we're seeing a huge number of flights. I think we did the mysterious flight in South America that was US security forces and others detained in South America because they were had representatives of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards on board. So according to the same article from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Iranian government, since the beginning of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, has made various flights to Moscow with Air Iran, Fars Air Kasham, Paya Air and Shahar Airline that all have direct links to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. According to Joran, who's an aviation watcher, Iran has flown at least 62 cargo flights to Russian airports from the start of the invasion, and that was up until the 10th of October. And it's only now that Tehran has finally conceded that it supplied drones to Russia, on occasion insisting that the weapons have been sent to Russia prior to Russia's President Putin's invasion, in which he launched his unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine last February. So what we're seeing here is looking at the supply lines. They're increasing their flights, supplying these military drones and hardware to the Russians. The Russians are quickly depleting their own military arsenal in this very costly war for them, and so therefore relying on lower cost technology such as these drones. But the danger is now that as the Russians are becoming more and more reliant upon Iranian military technology and missiles and drones, and of course last week one of those missiles hit Poland, there is a danger that this could trigger Article 5 of NATO, meaning that NATO would have to respond to a fellow NATO country such as Poland being attacked by Russia using Iranian military weapons. So let's have a look at this news report from CBN that gives a lot more context to this story about the prospect of Iranian-supplied Russian missiles hitting Poland and other member states of NATO.
Poland's president and the head of NATO say it appears the missile came from Ukrainian defense forces combating a barrage of incoming Russian missiles. Yesterday, President Biden suggested it did not come from Russia.
There is preliminary information that contests that. I don't want to say that till we completely investigate. It's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia, but we'll see.
The incident initially causing fears of an attack on NATO territory, which could escalate into a wider war.
You can't imagine really that Russia would have wanted to shoot missiles into Poland, knowing that it would garner some sort of response when they're already on their back foot.
Overnight, U.S. officials telling the Associated Press that early assessments suggest it was a Ukrainian missile fired to intercept Russian missiles. In the aftermath of the fall of Kherson, Russia launched its most intense barrage, sending almost 100 missiles into western Ukraine, killing civilians and destroying homes and businesses. Determining what exactly did happen is crucial, as an attack on a NATO country could create a confrontation between nuclear powers. Article 5 of NATO states an armed attack against one NATO nation shall be considered an attack against them all.
The United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch.
The incident has raised tensions in the region.
If NATO countries aren't careful, and I'm seeing some, particularly in the Baltic countries, making some pretty bombastic statements describing this as an attack and dangerous escalation. Wars can quickly spiral out of control. We're talking about countries with nuclear weapons.
An unfortunate accident is what Poland's president is calling the 2 deaths from Wednesday's missile. He emphasized Ukraine is not to blame for trying to defend itself. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Well, thankful to CBN for that helpful review, that helpful report that puts this in a bit of context. Simon, it is troubling that Iran, they have lied about their involvement in this. What's worse, though, is that they have tried to soften the blow of that lie being discovered by compounding it with a range of excuses that come across as more lies. After being found out, after having been backed into a corner on this, the Iranian foreign minister contradicted the statement being made by that ambassador only just days before. Hossein Amir Abdullahian admitted to supplying Russia with military drones when confronted with that mounting evidence. He said, though, that they had provided Moscow with a limited number of drones months before the war began, but has suggested that they do not support their use in the Ukraine conflict, which just doesn't ring true. We knew all the way back in April of 2021 that Russia was amassing troops on the border, that they were preparing for a conflict. We did another program, I believe, in November about it. Then we did another program in February, just a week or two before the conflict began, saying this was imminent. I don't know about you, Simon. I had people who I was engaging with who were denying that this was going to happen and that anyone who believed it was just being foolish. It would never happen. It did happen, and they have used, and proof has been that they have engaged Iran's military equipment in this conflict. And so the statement by Amir Abdullahian is that Tehran would not be indifferent to these drones being used in the Ukrainian conflict. But what are these war drones for, if not for some measure of expected warfare? Maybe they weren't aware that they would be used in the Ukrainian conflict, but what role has Iran played in trying to push for peace in this?
Well, I think you have to look at the bigger picture here, Reagan, and just look at Iran's nuclear weapons program and the lies after lies after lies that this regime has said to cover up its covert or not so covert nuclear weapons program. So we know that lies is part of their operation of Mirandai, and lies are an important part of that deception. And clearly what they want to do really is also test out their military drones in a theatre of war like the Ukraine. It gives them a lot of leverage over Putin and Moscow and strengthen those ties as well. And they'll be seeing if they can actually improve that drone technology and to use against Israel. So what we could see happening in the Ukraine could also then be used in the Middle East, used in Yemen, used in Syria. And don't forget, the Israelis have also shot down a couple of Iranian drones flying over the Golan Heights as well. So they have a track record for this. But this is what they said. This is the foreign minister of Iran. He went on to say that the Ukrainians, if they had any evidence that Iranian drones were being used in the conflict, they should send it to Tehran, where they will take into account their evidence. You know, there's photographic evidence, and we'll see a news report shortly showing that these are actually Iranian-made drones that the Russians are using. And even the Iranian mission was dismissed as a lie by the Ukrainian President Zelensky, responding to the Iranian mission. He said they decided to admit that they would supply drones for Russian terror. But even in this confession, they lie. We shoot down at least 10 Iranian drones every day, and the Iranian regime claims it alleges gave little, and even before the start of a full-scale invasion. So what we can see here is that the evidence is on the ground. The Ukrainians are using Western-style technology to actually bring down these Iranian military drones. And so therefore the Ukrainians have so much evidence to suggest that almost 10 a day are being targeted against Ukrainian population centers such as Kiev. There's power plants, it's water plants, it's power grids to effectively disable the country and give Putin's forces another kind of military weapon that they can use at their disposal to bring fear and intimidate the people of the Ukraine.
The Washington Institute, which is a political policy center based in the U.S. Capitol, has said that Iranian drones are becoming an increasingly important weapon for Russia in its war in the Ukraine. Firstly, they're used to strike a range of civilian and military targets. Their usage offers a glimpse into the future. This is a perfect planning ground for Iran. It's cheaply made attack equipment. It doesn't risk personnel. It can grind down expensive and sophisticated material. It just needs to be led and guided remotely. And so these Iranian manufactured drones, the Shahed 131 and Shahed 136, first turned up in Ukraine in mid-August of 2022. At the beginning, the Russian military employed them primarily as a battlefield one-way attack suicide drones, deploying them against Ukrainian artillery and other tactical targets. But since that point in time, we've also seen civilians have been dying throughout this process. It is something that happens tragically in any war, but Iran is playing a role in the death of Ukrainian civilians and wreaking havoc on the streets of Ukraine. And that's why as much of Ukraine as so many places are beginning to try to strive for a return of normality, there's this new battleground weapon essentially that's lurking in the background, because these suicide drone attacks come very suddenly. There's not a warning. You don't have any satellite observations of troops that can be chronicled. There's no way of preparation. It's sudden and swift, and that can be very, very jarring. And we have this report that speaks of Kiev residents and how they are striving for some sense of normalcy amid this continued Russian kamikaze drone attacks.
This is the aftermath of one of the many Russian attacks against Ukraine using Iranian-made drones. While Russia denies Iran is supplying it with drones, the Pentagon disagrees.
What that means, obviously, again, we continue to see Iran be complicit in terms of exporting terror, not only in the Middle East region, but now also to Ukraine.
These drones are, about as big as a person or two people, so they're not huge, and they carry a warhead, and the warhead can basically be used to slam into something. Now, in the case of the Russians, they're using this to basically terrorize civilians by attacking apartment complexes and going after the power grid and stuff.
Seth Frantzman, author of the book Drone Wars, warns Iran has become expert in drone technology and that Israel will likely face these kinds of Iranian-made drones.
I think clearly in any future war, we'll see that drones will be flying at Israel and attacking Israel from Iran, Iraq, maybe even from Yemen, and also, of course, from Syria and Lebanon. This is a way for Iran to extend the front line against Israel to a 4,000-mile front line. And that makes it more complicated to interdict and stop them and predict them and detect them.
But for Europe, the future is now.
These are Iranian rockets which are coming to Russia and going to be launched on European soil. They're going to kill European citizens, European energy infrastructure. It's well past time for the Europeans to actually start doing something.
Noronha and Franceman say the way the government of Iran is cracking down on the protests in its streets and this unholy alliance between Iran and Russia are a wake-up call to the West.
They're starting to realize that Iran doesn't share their interests and that Iran doesn't want peace and cooperation with the West. So it's sort of this common realization of just how dangerous Iran has been.
Finally, the West is waking up and saying, you know what, this is really not a regime that we can deal with. And the fact the Iranians are working with the Russians, and now the Iranians are terrorizing Ukrainian civilians with the drones, I think really everyone is saying, no, this regime is just awful, and we cannot ignore how bad it is anymore. And I think that's a big shift.
But the question remains, will Iran pay any consequences for its alliance with Russia? Right now, it's up to the U.S. and Europe.
And of course, that's the big question for tonight's programme. Should NATO classify Iran now as an enemy as it's threatening European security? It is directly involved in supplying military hardware and weapons to the Russians in their war against the Ukrainians, in which they invaded the Ukrainian nation back in February. Since they've manufactured these Shahed 131 and Shahed 136 drones, they turned up in Ukraine in mid-August of 2022. Firstly, the Russians started to use these drones on the battlefield as a one-way suicide drones, deploying them against Ukrainian artillery and other tactical weapons. But there was a strategic change in mid-October, as the Russians started using these drones as a key component of a coordinated campaign of strategic strikes against Ukrainians' critical infrastructures, targeting electricity grids, power generation plants, and also water stations. So Russia has also needed these drones to supply its fast depleting stocks of air and sea-launched cruise missiles, where they rely on only diminishing amounts of imported electronic components. They have an effective range of several hundred miles. The Shaheds have allowed the Russian military to strike targets deep inside western and central Ukraine from launch points such as the Crimea or southern Belarus. And the Russians also favouring these Ukrainian drones on the issue of finance because they're cost effective. Each of these drones costs in the region of $20,000 in comparison to air-to-air missiles or ground-based interceptors that cost anything between $400,000 and $1.2 million. So really we're seeing the Russia's military weapons and arsenals being massively depleted. It's costing them huge amounts of money, and so the Iranians have come here and say, look, we can give you these weapons at a fraction of the price. And this is why, according to the Ukrainian government, Russia has ordered somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400 drones from Iran. There's also reports now that Russia, as defense industry, is actually ready to move and establish its own licensed production of drones. So this is clearly the use of weapons, the weapons of the warfare.
I mean, drones are one thing, but ballistic missiles are another. And okay, yes, there's the cheapness of the drones, but that doesn't mean that Iran's not involved in ballistic missiles. Apart from their supply of these drones, there are credible reports that Tehran is also agreeing to supply Russia with those more expensive ballistic missiles. And of course, as viewers will be very well acquainted with, as we've talked about on this program before, this is troubling because Iran definitely has an increased capacity in regard to its nuclear power. It is doing a lot of exploration and investigation, pursuing nuclear weapons. There's very strong reason to believe they may already have nuclear weapons. I remember we did a program some time back that where we were told by experts, we've had a couple of programs on that, where experts have said that within a matter of weeks they would have nuclear capacity when it comes to their weapons program. So we're not talking about pieced together second-hand weaponry. We're talking about state-of-the-art stuff that can wreak absolute havoc. Iran's belated admission in its involvement in regard to its support of the Russian war effort, though they back it up with lies. So they admit they're involved, but they're not willingly involved, but they're not saying or doing anything that would keep them from being involved further. And the evidence is showing that they continue to be actively involved. It's all a web of lies and politics. Basically, it just destroys this idea that they are only involved and their interests are only involved to the Middle East. It seems that they're fully committed to supporting military action in Europe, which does represent an escalation in regards to their involvement in threatening global security.
And European security as well, which is really important. So according to a recent news report here, there is disturbing evidence that Iran is closely monitoring the West's military support for Kyiv to enhance its own military capabilities after it emerged that Russians flew a selection of American and British weapons to Iran in August as part of a deepening defense cooperation between Moscow and Tehran. And according to a Sky News report, a Russian military aircraft secretly transported the US Javelin anti-tank missile, a Stinger anti-aircraft missile, and a British An-Law anti-tank missile to an airport in Tehran in the early hours of the 20th of August. The weapons, which were part of a shipment of US and UK military equipment intended for the Ukrainian military that fell into Russian hands, have now been handed over to Iran's Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps amid fears that enable the Iranians to study Western military technology and copy it. And of course, we've also saw the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan back in the August of 2021, where the Americans left billions and billions of US dollars in military hardware and technology that, again, the Taliban ended up giving to the Iranians. So the danger is that they will use this technology, they will modify this technology, they will understand where the weakness is, improve their own technology, but also they have an understanding of the technology that we are using, so therefore becoming an even bigger threat to Britain, the United States, and to NATO. And that's why I think it's essential now that European leaders, including President Biden, gets to grips and realise the true extent and the threat that Iran poses to European and Western security.
It's not just military targets that Iran has been accused of seeking to involve themselves against. Ken McCallum's warning over Iran follows disclosure last week that two Anglo-Iranian journalists working for an independent Persian language television channel based here in the UK have been targeted for assassination by the Tehran regime. And I find it, Simon, a chilling similarity to Russia's involvement in the Salisbury poisonings a couple of years ago. Mr. McCallum said that Iran was the state actor which most frequently crosses into terrorism, labeling Tehran's intelligence services a sophisticated adversary. The current wave of protest in Iran has prompted the regime to resort to violence to silence critics. And even just this week, we've seen at least 5 individuals who were protesting killed by the Iranian security forces. Iran projects threat to the UK directly, though, and especially as the UK has been among Western nations actively condemning, actively involved in exposing some of Iran's threats to the Western world. It does threaten the UK directly through its aggressive intelligence services. At its sharpest, this includes ambitions to kidnap or even kill British or UK-based individuals perceived as enemies of the regime. And there have been at least 10 of those since January alone. So, I mean, viewers, you know, just the very fact that we are on this program, that we are talking about this, that we've had many programs involving Iran, indicates you don't know who is out there, you don't know what the threats are, you don't know what's going on. If you speak against the Iranian regime, how serious a threat they will consider you. Are you worth kidnapping? Are you worth knocking off? You don't know. So, you know, we stand in God's power, we stand in God's hands here.
And God's protection.
Absolutely.
But Reagan, I think that also this report put out by the head of MI5 or our secret services to say that Iran has intelligence operations here in Britain is extremely disturbing because in the early 90s this was their policy. So in the early 90s the Iranian regime would actually take out Iranian opposition leaders on European soil. So I think in Germany as well, they actually murdered some Iranian opposition leaders in cold blood at a cafe. Someone opened fire with a machine gun and actually killed them. And of course, the regime is becoming more schizophrenic. In a sense, it's not becoming rational anymore because they know that the end of their power, the end of their regime is near because the Iranian people are rising up, particularly the Iranian women at home, willing to challenge this regime that has been nothing but a totalitarian state, where it's used its own terror proxies like the Basijis and other internal security forces to suppress the people of Iran. And it's the Iranian women that are leading this revolution against wearing the forced wearing of the hijab, which is one of the key components of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its regime and its ideology. So this is making them more and more desperate that the Iranians in the diaspora now across the world are standing in solidarity with their own people against the regime. So we see that they're facing massive pressures. Economically, they're finding things extremely difficult because of the sanctions. You know, if they were able to sell completely their natural gas and oil on the market, this would bring in huge revenues for the regime itself. And of course, despite all this, the Biden administration has been pushing for an agreement with the Iranians on its nuclear weapons program, which is absolute madness, giving them billions in sanctions relief, allowing them to sell their oil and natural gas and to have nuclear weapons in 5 or 6 or 10 years' time, when the ideology of this regime is to bring about the return of the 12th Imam or the Mahdi or the Shia Messiah, to bring and usher in a new era or world empire being run from Tehran.
Yeah.
In which they feel that they have to trigger an apocalyptic style scenario in order for the Mahdi to return. So we know that we're dealing with absolute extremists within Iran. On the one hand, there are those who want to preserve the regime, and others that actually within the regime want to push the West, Iran into a massive military, if not a nuclear confrontation with the West. So therefore, when the Iranians say that they are peaceful, that their nuclear weapons program is all about energy and how they need energy supplies, we've got to understand that they are lying. But also we need to understand as well something even more sinister. And this is how we need to look at this through biblical eyes and spiritual eyes, that there is the Prince of Persia, that principality and power of darkness is over Iran. And under the Islamic Revolution of 79 and under this regime, they have declared not only Israel an enemy of the Iranian regime, but their desire to destroy Israel, to wipe Israel off the face of the earth and to destroy the Jewish people. So we know that the core ideological component of this regime is one of Jew hatred. And that is why the West needs to understand this, because the enemy first targets Israel and then targets Western nations. We saw this in World War II with Hitler. His ideology through Mein Kampf was Jew hatred at the very core of the Nazi ideology. The same with this regime. And we know it ends. It starts with the Jewish people, but never finishes with the Jewish people. And if the West doesn't stand up for Israel, then we could see ourselves endangered by the same regime as we're seeing in Europe and the Ukraine.
And it's important to recognize, you mentioned Hitler, you mentioned Nazi Germany, and there's a lot of policies that you could identify solo and say, oh, it sounds good. Oh, that sounds like it loves family, loves nation, it's patriotic. You could highlight those type of things. As I'm seeing, and let this be a word of challenge and caution, I'm seeing Christians do the same with Russia, saying, Putin's against this, Putin's for that, Putin is making a Christian stand on this, he's all about Christendom in this way. And you're picking up on little bits and pieces of it, but missing the bigger picture, missing the insidious stuff that saturates every other area. Broken clocks are right twice a day. A statement rings true in this. Putin continues to bolster ties with Iran. He continues to be involved in threatening not just Ukraine and its independent sovereignty, which is valid. It has its borders that should be respected, that aren't being respected. But with Putin's efforts to bolster his ties with Iran, increasingly, this is, as you rightly draw, a threat not only to the U.S., but also to Israel. CBN reports.
One major subject for the three leaders, how to divide their spheres of influence inside Syria, an issue of great concern to Israel.
In general, the work of Russia, Iran, and Turkey contributing to the comprehensive settlement of the crisis in Syria is highly effective.
Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi called to remove all U.S. troops east of the Euphrates River and an end to Israeli airstrikes inside Syria.
Might transpire out of this conference that the Russians will decide to limit the freedom of action of the Israeli Air Force in Syria as a result of their getting closer to the Iranians.
This could represent a threat to Israel, since it needs freedom of action inside Syria to stop Iran's further military buildup and the flow of arms to Iranian proxies like Hezbollah inside Lebanon. And here in the Middle East, many observers see the summit between these three major powers in the region as a signal to the United States.
It says a clear signal that Russia, a strong power, and two other strong Middle Eastern powers, such as Turkey and Iran, those are the most populous states in the region, are working together, cooperating, and they may cooperate, obviously, against American interests.
Middle East expert Ephraim Inbar says both the enemies and allies of the U.S. in the region see America as a weak power under the Biden administration.
Biden is not considered seriously in the Middle East. He's not considered a serious actor because America is weak. And in the Middle East, states and leaders are treating with respect only powerful leaders and powerful nations that are ready to act militarily to attain their interests.
Analysts warn that the combination of the growing alliance of Russia, Iran, and Turkey, along with a weak U.S. administration and Iran racing towards a nuclear bomb, all put increasing pressure on Israel.
On this issue, time is not on Israel's side. It's quite clear that the Iranians are progressing quite quickly toward a bomb. They have the missiles to carry it. They have probably to overcome the hurdle of weaponization. And this makes Israeli action quite urgent.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And of course, we see the closer that the Iranian regime gets to acquiring nuclear weapons, the closer it is that we could see an Israeli military response with airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities to stop them getting nuclear weapons. And this is the great danger that is in. We see that Iran is already the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism, with terror networks across the Middle East, across Africa, in Europe, right across South America, and even into North America as well. And so we see that threat. Now they're actually helping the Russians on the battlefield in their war against the Ukrainians on European soil. And just imagine it if this regime actually acquired nuclear weapons, if this regime got to a stage where they had the world's most dangerous weapons at their disposal, there'd even be a bigger menace and a threat to international security. But isn't it interesting is that the closer that we move into the end times, what the Bible describes as the end times, the book of Revelation, the tribulation period, the more that we're seeing these ancient alliances that the Bible spoke about, particularly as we look at Ezekiel 38 and 39. I mean, who would have thought even 3 years ago, for example, that the Iranians and the Russians would form such a strong political and military alliance, as we know that one day they will invade Israel from the north. So are we seeing really the grounds for this Russian Islamic Federation of Nations coming together to attack the Jewish state when Israel is dwelling in peace and safety? Or is it a kind of forerunner for what could happen in the years to come, maybe in a couple of decades from now? But we're seeing that really these old ancient alliances are coming together like the Bible says. And this is what is exciting, and this is also what is dangerous, because only by having a kind of moral clarity and only having a kind of biblical perspective do we know that we're not dealing with flesh and blood. We're not dealing with nations. We're dealing with principalities and powers of darkness. And we know, for example, that the prophet Daniel had to struggle. The archangel Gabriel, was it Archangel Gabriel that came with a vision to Daniel when he was Archangel Michael, to give a vision and a message from God, was pushed back for 30 days in Iran. And there was a massive spiritual battle in heaven for Daniel to get that vision, which translates to the times in which we're living in. So is it any surprise that as we draw to an end of world history, that these players that Israel had to deal with thousands of years ago, Israel is again dealing with these nations again today?
Yeah, I think, Simon, we do need to look at this through the lens of, yes, the here and now, but always with that eternal perspective, always asking and praying to God for wisdom, for clarity. Can we say dogmatically this is what's going on? We can't, but at the same time, we need to be aware of what the Scriptures promise. We need to be aware that Persia has always had this place in biblical prophecy. It's always had its role in the end times. It's very interesting that I see no clear spot. I may be wrong. I hold my hands up. I may be wrong on that. But others I know see no clear spot that the U.S. has in Bible prophecy. That there's nothing that's indicated there. If anything, it's among all of those nations that eventually rise against Israel. So, and what we, let's be honest, have kind of seen that. We've talked about that on the program before, how increasingly the U.S. As a whole is becoming more troubled by anti-Semitism. It is in its policies more and more against Israel. And so you could see this happening. Now, a question I would like to pose, Simon, is, and of course we're doing this right towards the end of the program, but like, what can be done? What should the response of the international community be? We've toyed with this a little bit throughout the year. We don't want undue escalation of conflict. There's not a desire for World War III, but we could also be damaging and creating a rod for our own backs in the future, making the conflict even worse if we don't go ahead and do something almost, you can't even say preemptively. They've gotten involved now. What can be done to keep this from escalating even further?
Well, firstly, we have to recognize that we're in a fallen world.
Yeah.
And that we're never going to have peace until the Messiah rules and reigns from Jerusalem for 1,000 years, Yeshua HaMashiach. But even then, he will rule with a rod of iron. So peace is not the natural condition of mankind. So what you have to do is have peace through strength. Threats to go to war in order to keep peace, because when nations, for example, Britain in the 1930s, the Biden administration, the Obama administration before then, deciding to pursue a policy of appeasement with dictators and authoritarian regimes, always emboldens them. And it's only by standing up to these aggressive states and showing strength and character and resolve and mean what you say can you push back their threats, as we saw that during the Trump administration. So therefore, I think it's an imperative that our NATO leaders and our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, together with Biden and also the European Union, recognises that if we don't deal with this Iranian menace in the Middle East, and if we don't get NATO to declare Iran an enemy of a threat and an enemy of NATO, then we're not going to actually deal with this problem at all. It's going to escalate and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And therefore, what's to stop? For example, we're also now finding out that Iranian troops are fighting in the Ukraine with Russian forces. Iranian-sponsored troops from Syria, fought in Syria, are now fighting in a European theatre of war. That's a scary prospect. And the danger is that will undermine European security. So I think it's absolutely imperative that our Western leaders show some backbone, show some moral courage and some resolve, and push back this Iranian menace and threat before it's too late. And it's also, history is an important indicator when we look at this, because nations who are at the heart are anti-Semitic, that at the heart of their ideology is Jew hatred, like the Iranian regime, like Hitler's regime before that. We know that they threaten the Jewish people, and the Iranian regime has threatened to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. They then become a threat to the West. And if the West doesn't realise that Israel is the canary down the mine and acts as the warning, then we've lost our moral clarity, we've lost our moral judgment, we no longer know what's right and what's wrong, and so therefore we're even in greater danger and peril than we can even possibly begin to think.
Yeah, so our governments need to, I think that to some degree they are aware. I think they are awake to it, but I think there's been an impotent response. There's not been any active reply. We're past the point of words, I believe, Simon. There's been so many words spoken, so much talk about sanctions this and sanctions that, but we're getting to a point where there actually needs to be some meaningful action. With rising protests in Iran, I don't think it's enough to have slogans and to express thoughts and prayers for the Iranian people. It's now time to actively go beyond sanctions. This is an opportunity. I do believe we're at a critical point in time where our Western leaders can show authority. They can step in a situation. The truth of the matter is what's going on in Iran, the unrest that's present there, all it would take would be a very brief action to completely upend and overturn the current state of affairs, the authoritarian regime that is there, that would cause rampant disruption to the Russian situation in Ukraine. It would disrupt Iran's ongoing nuclear program. It would receive some outcry from Iran's allies. But should we seek the approval of other terrorist states? Should we seek the approval of others who are engaged in actively undermining Western, and not just Western, global security? Those are questions that I think we need to ask.
Absolutely, but also I think we have to take into context as well where that in Iran the gospel is spreading like wildfire, that more Iranians are coming to faith in Iran than I think any other country in the world.
That's correct.
So therefore what we're seeing there is the Holy Spirit is moving powerfully in Iran, to the extent we are seeing the biggest political upheaval and unrest in Iran since the Islamic Revolution of '79. So the question is, I don't think they can survive for long. We've also seen that this nation has cursed Israel, that is threatened to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and therefore is under direct God's judgment, according to Genesis 12, 1-3. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. This regime has cursed Israel, it has cursed the Jewish people. So there's only so long that God will allow them to continue in their actions before divine judgment falls upon them, and before He is the one who's able to bring down this regime. So, a prayer is the most powerful weapon that we have at our disposal, and so therefore it's imperative, I think, to pray for the Iranian people, that they would have courage, and to pray that God would bring down this regime, because we can see then that Iran in history has been a force for incredible good. Remember King Cyrus. He allowed allowed the Jewish people in exile in Babylon to return to Israel and rebuild the Second Temple. And we see prior to the revolution of Iran in 79 that Iran and Israel were close allies, and they can be again. And that's why it's imperative that we pray, and we pray for change. Reagan, absolute pleasure to be doing our mornings with you, particularly on this topic of the Iranian threat to national security on Behind the Headlines, so that we can really focus on the real danger, which is Iran. And this is something our Western leaders need to wake up to. No doubt our security forces truly understand the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran, not only to Britain, but also to the United States and to Europe, particularly as now they are operating on the European theatre of war. It's imperative that we pray and also awake our political leaders to the threat that Iran poses, not only to Israel, the Middle East, but now to Europe. So it's time for NATO to classify Iran as an enemy state and a threat to European security. So thank you for watching this week's Behind the Headlines.